What's up guys, Asian here with another build video. This one's going to be on the relatively short side. This time we're going to be taking a look at a beginner stamina gear setup as well as a sample parse just so you guys can kind of take a comparison between this sort of sample gear setup, this beginner gear setup, and kind of compare it to a more meta gear setup. Part of this is to show you guys that beginner gear does not necessarily pull bad DPS. It is going to pull less DPS than your meta setup, but it is to kind of also show you guys that beginner gear isn't necessarily bad by any means, and you're still capable of pulling very good DPS by using beginner gear as long as your rotation is on point. So this basis behind getting the gear for this video is basically any gear that is base game, so either from base game dungeons to base game overland sets, or you can purchase it off of guild traders. So basically somebody who just picks up ESO right off the bat is able to pick up these sets, assuming they're able to buy it, or craft it, or get somebody to craft it for them, etc. You don't have access to any jewelry crafting or transmutation of jewelry, so you won't be able to use bloodthirsty jewels. And so dungeon sets are largely going to be off the table here because, again, the basis behind this is anybody can pick up the game, get to CP 160 and get this gear, or start working towards getting this gear pretty much right away without having the need to necessarily farm for anything. So either stuff you can craft or things you can buy off of guild traders. That's the general basis behind this. So we're not going to be using any sort of unique monster helm sets. We're not going to be using any sort of arena sets. It's all going to be either crafted or overland sets. No transmutations allowed. And that's pretty much kind of how I went. Now everything you see here will be gold, and that's just because on the PTS, on template characters, they only give you gold stuff. But realistically, you can use purple armor or purple jewelry if you don't have the gold tempers in order to upgrade it all the way up to gold. As long as your weapons are gold, that's the only real thing that matters here. So as long as your weapons are gold, the jewelry, armor, they can be purple. A rarity, you definitely want to get to, at the very least, do purple. Blue is a little bit too weak, so just make sure to get up to at least purple. You will lose about 1k, 2k DPS compared to what the parse you're about to see today, but it's overall not that big of a loss, and you also save quite a bit of money. So in terms of gear, two 5-piece sets. We're going with the Briarheart and Hunding's Rage. Now you can replace the Briarheart with New Moon Acolyte if you'd like, but I kind of refrained from using New Moon Acolyte mainly because of the sustain hit that you take. I am on a Nightblade here, and this is just for the parse comparison purposes, but even on a Nightblade, it's going to be challenging to fully sustain a light attack rotation using New Moon Acolyte. You could always use New Moon Acolyte if you'd like, but I find it easier just to use Briarheart. The other thing with New Moon Acolyte is that you will need to craft at least one piece of jewelry if you use New Moon Acolyte with Hunding's Rage. And crafting jewelry is going to be expensive. You're going to have to outsource that because, again, we're assuming you don't have access to Somerset, so you can't craft jewelry. So that usually will cost you quite a bit of money to get a single jewelry piece of either Hunding's Rage or New Moon Acolyte. Certainly possible to do so, but it's definitely going to take a bigger hit on your wallet. So instead we're going to go with Briarheart. This is an overland set from Hrothgar, but because it's an overland set, you can buy it off guild traders. We are going with Helm Shoulders here, and then we have one jewelry of Briarheart, again because we don't want to waste money crafting a Hunding's Rage jewelry piece. Then two other armor pieces for 5 total pieces of Briarheart. And we have 5 total pieces of Hunding's Rage. So we have 3 armor pieces, the jack, the waist, the legs, and then we have our weapons, dagger, axe, and bow. And then for jewelry, we have 2 agility jewelries as well. That's because we're not using monster helm sets, and agility is going to give us the best sort of return on our investment for our 2-piece effect here. 1752 max stamina is higher than your typical 129 weapon damage that you would get from another set. For armor, traits and enchants, all divines, all max stamina enchants. All for jewelry, we only have robust, so make sure to have the robust trait on these jewelry pieces. So Briarheart jewelry can come in all 3 traits, as can agility, so just make sure you're getting the robust traits. Then all weapon damage enchants here. For weapons, you need Nirnhorn on the main hand, Sharpen on the offhand. We are using double Ravage Health poisons. If you don't want to run those, then you can run Poison enchant and then Absorb Stamina enchant. Then for your back bar, we have Infused with a weapon damage enchant. So pretty much what you would expect to see on a typical meta build, just with different jewelry traits, because we're assuming that we can't transmute to Bloodthirsty or Infused. Everything else pretty much remains exactly the same between meta builds. So for stamina builds, Dark Elves or Orcs are going to be your best race. The sort of sustain-oriented races might be better if you want to run New Moon Acolyte instead of Hunting's Rage or instead of Briarheart. So those would be the Red Guards, the Bosmer, or the Imperials if you have access to the Imperial Edition. Those three races definitely have a better chance of sustaining a light attack rotation while using New Moon Acolyte. So if you want to use that set, you can potentially do a full light attack rotation with those three sustain races. It is still going to be challenging. 5% increase cost to all abilities is still a pretty large cost increase, but it's going to be easier compared to if you were to try to do it on an Orc or a Dark Elf. Then of course, Khajiits are best if you kind of want to take a sort of balanced approach if you want to potentially play other roles in the game, just because of their well-balanced stats. All points into stamina here. Like I mentioned in other build videos, you can shift some points into health if you feel like you need survivability. Not absolutely necessary, but always a good option to do so. Stone is going to be the shadow, and we are using Lava Foot for parse purposes. That way we can accurately compare the two parses, and we can accurately compare sustain in true in-raid scenario. So while this build is not necessarily designed for vet DLC trials, you can still bring this sort of gear set to vet Craglorn trials and probably some of the easier vet DLC trials, no problem, as long as your rotation is up to snuff. So you will be able to get raid style buffs, so things like combustion synergy, other types of synergies, Symphony of Blades, etc. So Lava Foot pretty accurately represents sustain you would see in an actual trial. The food you would use in a trial can vary. It's either going to be buy stat food, so that's just max stamina, max health, or it can be something like DPS Command and Throne or Artam Takeaway Broth if you need additional sustain. Just keep in mind that if you're using Dubious Command and Throne or Artam Takeaway Broth, you have less health, so you might need to shift some points in that health to get to a good amount of health, depending on kind of where you are comfortable with your overall survivability. Skills are exactly what you would see for your typical meta build. So on a Nightblade, for example, Killer's Blade, Rapid Strikes, Deadly Cloak, Relentless Focus, Barbed Trap, Incapacitating Strike, Back Bar, Soul Trap, Poison Injection, Arrow Barrage, Leeching Strike, Dark Shade, Incapacitating Strike. Just look at my other build videos for each specific class that you are, so you know what sort of rotation and skills you should be using. CP points, again, check out each individual class to see if there's any variation in your CP point distribution. You're always going to want to have at least 100 into Mooncalf here for green CPs. The rest can be wherever you'd like. Then for blue CPs, the big one is going to be make sure you're getting up to the pen cap with the appropriate amount of CP points into piercing. And then again, check out everything else in the specific class video if you want to know exactly what your CP setup should be for a specific class, because each class does have a little bit of variation in their CP setup. So now we're just going to go ahead and do a sample parse. So I already did a parse with the meta setup, and then we'll do a parse here with this beginner setup, and we'll be able to compare the two parses so you guys can see how much of an actual DPS loss it is compared to running a full meta setup here. So again, rotation remains exactly the same between meta and your beginner gear setup. There's no change in your rotation just because you're using different types of gear. Rotation doesn't affect, gear doesn't affect rotation. Even if you're using something like, let's say you're running Shadows of Red Mountain, for example, just because it's an overland set that a lot of beginner people like to run, you're still not going to be changing up your rotation. The rotation is designed basically to take into account all the possible different aspects. If you're running some sort of unique set that requires you to run certain abilities, yeah, you can take out an ability and use it. But generally speaking, if you're running a set like that, chances are you're giving up DPS by using that set in the first place. And this particular kind of gear setup is designed to basically maximize DPS for the lowest amount of investment. So let's go ahead and get started with our parse. Again, you're not going to be seeing sort of the parse numbers that you see in sort of the meta gear videos. That's just not realistic and kind of unreasonable to ask for a beginner gear video. But you will end up seeing still pretty good DPS, I think, by the end of this video here. So light weaving and parsing rotation is still going to be the best way to increase your DPS. So even if you are just starting off, if you want to be a good DPS, I'd recommend definitely focusing on mastering your rotation first before you go out and farm for your meta gear sets. Farming for your meta gear is not going to improve your DPS too much if your rotation is pretty bad. So always practice your rotation first before farming for gear. Since we're not running with Cassis, you can actually use energies on both bars. I'm just using it on front bar out of habit, probably. Oops. I missed the light weave. I'm not sure if you guys are able to hear the Briarheart proc. You might be able to hear it over all the other sounds. But I am getting the Briarheart proc. You can also see it on my arms. My arms are glowing, glowing yellow. A little bit hard to see the glow. Missed the light attack there. DPS is lower than your typical meta build, as you can see here. If you just kind of take a side-by-side comparison of meta build on my channel, for example, and the DPS that we're pulling here, you will notice that we are definitely pulling lower DPS. It's actually not that bad, all things considered. You know, when you consider that we're not running a Monster Helm set or any sort of meta sets. Losing out on Reliquin is actually a very big DPS loss. I'm going to execute here. Gonna keep on executing. We're not gonna bother re-upping our back bar dots here. Alright, so there we go. That is a sample parse. You can see the DPS down in the lower left-hand corner, just shy of 66k or so. Let's see if I can find the full parse here. So this is the parse I did earlier with the full meta build. So this would be Reliquin, Laquestes, and I used Celine's. So I pulled 81.6k. So if we just take a look at the percentage difference between the two, so it'd be it's off screen really fast. 946 divided by initial 6. That's about a 23.8% loss in DPS. So we're losing quite a bit of DPS, mainly from the loss of Reliquin and Laquestes, the major Slayer uptime. But 66k or so. That's still pretty respectable DPS considering we're just picking up gear that's crafted and purchasable off of guild traders. Agility is pretty cheap to get. Briarheart's also fairly cheap. The armor pieces at least, and the jewelry is relatively cheap, and Rothscott's been around for a while, so there's a lot of pieces in circulation. So again, 66k on a trials dummy is, in the guild that I've been in, that's usually enough to get you into a VMAW. Definitely enough to get you into Vet Craglorns. It's usually enough to get you into Vet Asylum and Vet Cloudrust as well. Those two trials are a little bit iffy because this is a stem DPS, so we prefer magic DPS for those two trials. Definitely enough to clear Veteran Sunspire as well. Not hard mode Sunspire, but at the very least Veteran Sunspire. Beginner gear is definitely capable of pulling enough DPS to clear, at the very least, some of the Vet DLC trials, maybe not all configurations of the Vet DLC trials, and certainly just barely meets the cusp for Vet Craglorn hard mode trials. You will definitely need to get more a stronger gear if you want to do Vet DLC hard mode trials. But for pretty much, I want to say anywhere between like 60 to 70% of the Vet trial content in the game, you will be able to basically complete it. The only thing that you wouldn't really be able to complete with this level of DPS would be those Vet hard mode DLC trials, and that's not really that many. That's only 5 trials or so. So I should say 5 trials configuration. So just because you have beginner gear doesn't mean that you can't pull good DPS. It's just a matter of practicing your rotation and mastering your rotation. But that concludes this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.